I will never forget the way the room shifted that night, the way my heart seemed to drop straight into my stomach as I realized I had just been cut out of my own family. It happened at what was supposed to be a simple family dinner. The table was set with polished silverware. Candles flickered softly against the glassware, and the smell of roasted chicken lingered in the air. I had brought my homemade rolls, the same recipe I'd been making since my children were small. For years, those rolls had been the centerpiece of every family meal. But that evening, they sat untouched at the far end of the table, like an artifact from a past no one wanted to remember. As the laughter and conversation swirled around me, I heard words that pierced deeper than any knife. They weren't shouted. They weren't even said with cruelty, just delivered with a casualness that made them land even harder. I realized, in that moment, that decisions about my future had been made without me, and I was no longer part of the picture. My daughter-in-law's perfectly manicured smile, my son's polite but distant tone, the way my grandchildren avoided my eyes, it all told me that I had been moved from the center of their world to the margins, like a book they had already read and no longer needed. The betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, delivered like a business transaction. My son explained that things would be simpler if I no longer lived in the house I'd built my life around. My daughter-in-law added that safety and efficiency were more important now. They used words that sounded responsible, even caring. But to me, they felt like nails sealing a coffin. They had already packed decisions into neat little boxes. My wishes, my memories, my sacrifices, they didn't matter. I was no longer seen as a mother who had given everything I had. I was an obstacle they needed to move. As I sat there, I couldn't help but think back over the years. The long nights I stayed up working double shifts after my husband passed away. The mornings when I packed lunches and pressed uniforms, even though my body ached. The times I said no to myself so that I could say yes to my children. I had carried the weight of our little family on my shoulders for decades. I had believed, foolishly, that those sacrifices would be remembered with gratitude. But now, staring across the table at the people I loved most, I realized I was wrong. Gratitude had given way to calculation. Love had been replaced with convenience. It wasn't just the decision itself that hurt, it was the arrogance behind it. The way my daughter-in-law adjusted her bracelet as if she were chairing a board meeting. The way my son avoided my eyes, burying himself in his phone, pretending that numbers and charts could shield him from the truth of what he was doing. They both acted as though I should be thankful, as though stripping me of my place in my own family was some kind of gift. That arrogance cut deeper than anything else. It told me that they didn't see me as a person anymore, just a problem to be managed. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to remind them of everything I had done. But instead, I sat in silence because I knew that nothing I said would reach them. They had already decided, in their minds, the chapter of me as a necessary part of their lives was over. They had turned the page, and I was just an afterthought left behind. But deep down, even through the shock and the bitterness, I felt something else start to rise. A quiet voice inside me whispered that this wasn't the end of my story. I might have been blindsided, but I wasn't powerless. Not yet. I could see the cracks in their polished performance, the small tells that hinted there was more going on beneath the surface. And I promised myself, right then and there, that I would not just sit quietly while they rewrote my life without me. That night was the moment everything shifted. The betrayal was sharp, but it was only the beginning. Looking back, I can see now that the warning signs had been there all along. The little dismissive comments, the way my belongings had slowly been moved or replaced. The decisions made without asking me. I just hadn't wanted to believe it. But now, with my heart split open and my trust shattered, I could no longer look away. This was only the start of a story I never imagined I would have to tell. In the days after that dinner, I carried an uneasiness I couldn't shake. It was like a shadow clinging to me, following me from room to room. At first, I told myself I was overreacting. Families have disagreements, after all. Maybe I had just misunderstood their words or tone. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted. I could feel it in the way my son avoided my calls, in the polite but cold texts that replaced real conversation, in the way my daughter-in-law suddenly took charge of every little matter that used to be shared. At home, my life was modest but steady. My small apartment was old, but it carried warmth in every corner. A faded armchair by the window, stacks of books I'd read over the years, photo frames filled with memories of my children when they were young. There was nothing luxurious about it, but it was mine earned through decades of sacrifice. I clipped coupons, stretched my pension check, and still found joy in baking bread or tending to the few plants on my balcony. But whenever I visited their home, the contrast was blinding. Marble countertops gleamed like museum displays. A chandelier dripped crystals above the dining table, and the scent of expensive candles replaced the smell of real food. My daughter-in-law, Ashley, walked through those rooms like a queen surveying her castle. She always had a new outfit, a new handbag, some new project that needed attention. And while she smiled at me, her words always carried an edge. A little remark about my cardigan being outdated. A suggestion that maybe I should move closer to them for safety. I started to notice how her kindness felt rehearsed, her compliments hollow. And then there were the small manipulations. Papers I'd left in my purse suddenly misplaced. Bills redirected so I no longer received them directly. Phone calls from the bank that I never remembered making. I thought perhaps my memory was slipping, but the more I paid attention, the more I realized these weren't accidents. Ashley was always nearby when things went missing. She always had the explanation, the solution, the answer before I even asked. The weight of it pressed down on me. For years, I had trusted her, believing she had my best interest at heart. I had let her handle things after my husband passed, grateful for her efficiency. But now, looking back, I saw how easily I had handed her pieces of my life, one small document at a time. The first undeniable clue came on a Tuesday morning. I was sorting through the mail when I noticed an envelope from a bank I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was junk mail, but curiosity made me open it. Inside was a statement for an account under my name, except I had never opened such an account. The address on the statement wasn't even mine. It was a house in a nearby suburb, one I knew belonged to Ashley's cousin. My hands trembled as I read the numbers. The balance showed thousands of dollars moving in and out, transactions I had never authorized. My name was there, my social security number, but none of it was mine. It was as if someone had taken my life and worn it like a mask. I sat there at my kitchen table, staring at that paper while the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. A sick feeling washed over me. This wasn't a misunderstanding, and it wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate, calculated, proof that I had been betrayed in a way far deeper than careless words at a dinner table. Anger began to replace the unease. For years, I had bent over backwards to keep peace, to make sure my son and his family had what they needed. I had excused the comments, ignored the dismissals, and convinced myself that patience was the best path. But now, with the evidence in my hands, I could no longer lie to myself. Something was terribly wrong. My family wasn't just drifting away from me, they were actively pushing me out, stripping away my identity piece by piece. And the worst part was knowing it hadn't started that night at dinner. The warning signs had been there all along. I just hadn't wanted to see them. I folded the bank statement carefully, tucking it back into the envelope. My heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. This was more than arrogance or neglect, this was betrayal. And if I wanted to protect myself, I needed to find out just how deep it went. That morning marked a turning point. I was no longer just suspicious. I was determined. I knew I had to look closer, to dig into the things I had been too trusting to question. Because if this one statement existed, there had to be more. And I wasn't going to sit quietly and wait for them to take everything from me. I didn't sleep much after the envelope arrived. By 2340, the apartment had settled into the small creaks and sighs of an old building, and I was at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee that had gone bitter. I spread everything out under the lamp, my checkbook, the bank statement with my name and someone else's address, a folder of warranties and tax returns I'd kept since my husband died. The light made a tight circle on the table, the rest of the room fading to shadow. My hands were steady. My breathing wasn't. I started with what I could verify. I pulled years of my own statements and scanned for anything that didn't fit. At first, the numbers were familiar groceries, utilities, the pharmacy I use every other month. Then a pattern surfaced small, regular automatic transfers I didn't recognize. 85 here, 140 there, 210 every other Friday. Individually, they could have been errors. Together, they had the rhythm of a plan. The destination accounts were masked, but the initials matched the bank that had mailed the mystery statement. My name was the common thread. By 0105, I remembered how easily I had trusted Ashley after my husband passed. She had offered to help set up autopay because late fees are predatory. I had watched her type, grateful for the help, and I had looked away when she asked to snap a quick photo of my driver's license just for the file. I could hear the hum of that night's grief in my ears even now. Convenience had been the first compromise. I made a list call the bank, check credit reports, review mail forwarding. I added a question that made my chest go tight: who opened that account with my name and social security? The statement showed transfers in amounts that looked like round sums a person might use to test a system: 500, 800, 1200. The outgoing amounts looked like rent, utilities, online shopping. The address belonged to Ashley's cousin's house. I'd delivered holiday cookies there once. I remembered the front yard, 2 ceramic lions, and a wreath with glittering ribbon. My name had been living in that house without me. Around 0215, I logged into my retirement portal. I'd barely touched it in years, but the site had a message flag I'd never seen: beneficiary update in progress. My heart snagged. The request date was recent. The mailing address was not mine. The system wanted a second factor code I didn't receive because the phone number on file wasn't mine either. Somewhere along the way, my contact information had been quietly replaced, like a picture swapped out in a frame. I stood up and paced the kitchen tile to steady my breath. The kettle clicked against its base when I set it down too hard. I thought of the dinner, of Ashley's cool glow moving through her house, of my son's eyes fixed anywhere but on me. Anger rose and fell like a wave. Beneath it, something sturdier took shape. I've been underestimated before. I thought. It keeps people from noticing when I'm counting. I requested mailed copies of all recent changes from every account I owned. I set fraud alerts. I wrote formal letters, the kind that require certified mail and signatures. Then I checked my credit. 2 inquiries I didn't recognize sat there like bruises, a department store card and a personal line of credit. Both opened within the last 60 days. Both using my correct date of birth and social security. Both with a mailing address that was close enough to mine to slide past a hurried clerk my street name with a different unit number. A deliberate near miss. In the morning, I called the bank whose envelope had started this. I used my best bookkeeper voice from a lifetime ago. The one that made vendors produce receipts without a fight. The representative read a note I could almost see on her screen. Power of attorney on file. Presented in branch. Copy of driver's license and utility bill provided. My stomach went cold. A power of attorney would explain the transfers. It would also require my signature. I asked for the signature record. When the packet arrived 2 days later, I set it under the same yellow pool of light and looked at a version of my name that wasn't mine. The letters had the right slope, the same oversized loop on the Y, but the pressure was wrong, the spacing wrong. Someone had learned me well enough to imitate me. I traced the line with my finger and felt heat climb the back of my neck. The notary stamp belonged to a shipping store across town. The witness line carried a name I recognized from one of Ashley's holiday parties, her friend who handles paperwork all day. I told no one what I found. Instead, I listened. At 18:20 on a Thursday, I stopped by their house with a tin of brownies and left it at the door, an excuse to linger on the porch. Through the foyer, I could hear Ashley's voice in the den, light and sure in a way that told me she felt safe. She mentioned consolidating accounts before the evaluator comes and getting Mom's cooperation for the move. Evaluator. Move. The words slid into place like puzzle pieces I hadn't realized I was holding. I thought of the way she had framed safety at dinner, the way my son had nodded along without looking at me. If you make a person seem incompetent on paper, their consent becomes a courtesy. The second twist was not just that my name had been used, but that a corridor was being built around me, accounts rerouted, beneficiaries changed, credit opened, the narrative of a woman who couldn't manage her own life rehearsed in advance. It wasn't an accident, it was infrastructure. I printed copies of everything: the forged power of attorney, the address changes, the credit pulls. I labeled folders like I used to label report binders at work. I slid a small recorder into my purse not for theatrics, but because people who perform control often repeat their lines. I scheduled an appointment with the bank manager for 10:30, then called my longtime neighbor, a retired attorney, to ask what documents he would bring to a conversation like mine. By the time the sun sank on Sunday, I knew what I needed: a room with a table, other people's eyes, and the truth in order. I sent a calm group text proposing dinner at 18:30. I offered to bring my rolls. I preheated the oven anyway, not because I expected them to taste them, but because sometimes you keep one old tradition on the table as a reminder of where you started. The fear in my chest hadn't vanished. It had changed shape: cleaner, sharper, more useful. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was ready. Part of me still hoped I was wrong. The rest of me was folding evidence into a neat stack I could place between us when the time came. At 18:30, I walked into Ethan's dining room with a calm I hadn't felt in months. The long table was set with polished silver and crystal, every rose in its vase perfectly arranged, as if perfection itself could hide the rot beneath. My hands no longer shook. I had come prepared, and for once, I wasn't the guest who faded into the background. I had a folder in my bag, thick with papers I had spent weeks gathering. Statements, copies, letters, and photographs. Every late night at my kitchen table. Every quiet moment when they thought I wasn't paying attention, it had all led here. Dinner began like all the others. Vanessa's voice carried over the clinking glasses as she told stories of charity galas and new furniture. Ethan laughed in the right places, though his eyes rarely found mine. For years I had sat through these dinners in silence, swallowing remarks, folding my napkin again and again under the table. Tonight, I unfolded it once, laid it across my lap, and lifted my head. When dessert arrived, I pushed back my chair. My voice was steady. Before anyone leaves, I have something to share. The room stilled. Even Vanessa, who thrived on control, paused mid-sentence. I placed the folder in the center of the table and began to speak. I told them about the charges that had first caught my eye, small at first. Shoes for Tyler, school supplies, then larger spa packages, expensive restaurants, weekend getaways billed to my account. I laid down copies of the statements, each one with Vanessa's name. Her smile wavered, but she didn't speak. I went on, describing the mortgage delays, the missing payments, and the new car parked in their driveway while bills in my name went unpaid. Then came the forged signature, the document filed quietly, shifting ownership of one of my properties without my consent. I held it up, my name misspelled, the ink strokes shaky. This was the moment I knew. I said. The moment I understood this wasn't just carelessness. This was theft. Gasps circled the table. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to look at me or at Vanessa. I didn't give them time to decide, because the truth was deeper than I had imagined. That was the night's third and sharpest twist. I slid the final set of papers forward, bank logs tracing online changes, logins from Ethan's office, not Vanessa's, transfers authorized in the middle of his workday, adjustments made from the very network in this house. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had wanted so badly to believe my son was simply blind, swayed by love and manipulation, but the evidence didn't lie. He hadn't just stood by. He had signed, clicked, authorized. He had built the betrayal with his own hands. The silence was louder than any shouting could have been. Vanessa's face drained of color, her eyes darting to Ethan, looking for rescue. But Ethan's hands were flat on the table, his jaw tight, caught between denial and the weight of proof he couldn't escape. I felt no triumph, only a strange clarity. For years I had carried them, excused them, defended them to neighbors who whispered. Tonight, I put down that burden. I straightened my back, my voice stronger now. I will not be erased from my own life. I will not fund greed disguised as family. From this moment, every account is secured. Every asset is protected. And every lie you've built will be dismantled in daylight. A ripple moved through the guests, a mix of discomfort and admiration. No one dared laugh at me this time. I gathered the folder, tucking the evidence back into place. My heart still ached, it always would, but beneath the ache was something firmer. Resolve. When I stood, no one tried to stop me. I left the untouched dessert, the roses, the polished silver. As I stepped out into the night air, cool and sharp against my face, I knew I had shifted the story. For the first time in years, I was no longer the silent mother at the end of the table. I was the woman who faced betrayal and refused to bow. And part 5, the part that mattered most, would be about what came after rebuilding, protecting, and finally choosing myself. In the weeks that followed, everything unraveled exactly as I knew it would. The forged documents were revoked, the accounts restored, and the banks placed their fraud alerts like guardrails around my life. Investigators stepped in, and the polished image Ethan and Vanessa had built began to collapse under the weight of their own choices. Neighbors stopped by with half-whispered questions, their eyes wide with disbelief. Friends who had once envied their lifestyle now shook their heads. And as for me, I didn't celebrate their downfall. I simply exhaled, finally free from the burden of pretending not to see. For years, I had believed strength meant keeping the peace, staying silent, carrying the weight for everyone else. But true strength, I learned, is different. It's standing tall when others expect you to bow. It's choosing dignity over appearances, truth over comfort. The betrayal hurt in ways I still don't have words for. To see my own child tangled in it that will always leave a scar. But scars tell stories, and mine will always remind me that survival is not weakness. Survival is proof of endurance. Life has grown quieter now, and in that quiet, I have found peace. My home, small and simple, feels more like a fortress than any mansion ever could. And I've learned to trust myself again, the woman they underestimated, the woman they thought they could erase. If there's one lesson I want you to take from my story, it's this: family is not defined by who shares your blood, but by who stands beside you with honesty and respect. Never let anyone convince you that protecting yourself is betrayal. Sometimes, protecting yourself is the only way to honor the life you fought so hard to build. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If my story touched you, share it so someone else might find courage too. Leave me a comment, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Because our voices matter most when we speak them out loud.